200 years of German migration to Brazil.
They came to the jungle. There was nothing.
In search of a better life.
This is El Dorado. This will be my new home.
There are stories of dreams and suffering.
It's a very painful story because of all the massacres we've experienced.
I'm Guilherme Becker. I'm from southern Brazil and I work as a journalist in Germany, which is where my family once emigrated from. I want to take you on a journey spanning 200 years of German immigration in Brazil. I have family in Brazil and Germany. They had no contact for almost a century. It wasn't until many years after my grandmother's death.
That's when I finally met my mother's close relatives.
My family history is one of migration. That's what we'll be exploring on our journey. The hopes.
My heart was pounding.
And how people's lives are shaped by history.
Progress was seen as tied to Europeanization, not just of customs and traditions, but of the population itself.
Filming in Brazil in April 2024, we had no way of knowing that a once-in-a-century catastrophe was about to hit my home state of Rio Grande do Sul. Places I had visited with our camera crew would be submerged in floodwaters just days later. People would lose their homes, and sometimes even their lives. But our journey begins before that, more than 1,000 kilometers further north. São Paulo is a megacity, a melting pot, and the cultural and economic heart of Brazil. It's home to more than 12 million people. Over the centuries, people have come here from countless countries. Some came voluntarily from Europe or Asia. Others were captured and sent to Brazil as slaves. Around 1900, the city experienced a huge influx of immigrants. The newcomers drove industrialization and urbanization. They're the focus of the country's immigration museum, located on an historically significant railroad line. Right here on this platform is where trains from the port of Santos arrived carrying immigrants. From 1887 until the 1970s, this was Brazil's largest home for immigrants. People's luggage would be disinfected here. New arrivals would be registered and given medical checks.
The hostel was built to comfortably house 2,000 to 3,000 people, but by the end of the 19th century, it was accommodating between 8,000 and 10,000 people on a given day. There was a lot of tension on the part of the immigrants, the workers, and also the native people. There was a fear of epidemics and of foreigners. So this place reminds us of the history of immigration as a whole, with all the associated hope and suffering. This building contains all those stories.
Multiple fires broke out in the hostel, caused by the immigrants' unauthorized cooking. The names of 12,000 immigrants are engraved on the museum's walls. But one name I can't find is that of my grandmother, Ida, who arrived here in 1925. 1,000 kilometers south is the town of Campo Bom, near Novo Hamburgo, in the state of Rio Grande do Sul. This is where I grew up, and where my parents live. My grandma Ida lived here for almost 30 years until her death in 1997. The family lost contact with my grandma's siblings after the Second World War. In the 1980s, my father attempted to track down our relatives in Germany, unsuccessfully.
I wrote a letter in Portuguese, which my mother translated into German. We sent it to Visbeck, the town where my mother was born. 3 months later, we got a reply. 2 of my mother's sisters had already died. Her brother had died in the war. And there was no information about the third sister. So all contact had been lost.
In fact, the nieces and grandnieces of my grandma Ida live in this small town in the German state of Lower Saxony.
One thing we have in common with our Brazilian family is the food.
The fact that we found each other in 2021 is nothing short of a miracle. I'd finished studying in Germany, and in order to apply for citizenship, I'd requested documents from the authorities in my grandma's birthplace. It just so happened that the same official was also contacted by my grandma's German niece, who was making a family tree.
My heart was pounding. I'd finally found someone related to Aunt Ida.
For decades, my grandma Ida was a gap in the family story. She had emigrated to Brazil with foster parents in 1925, while her 4 biological siblings stayed with their father in Germany. She never saw them again, and Irmgard never got to meet her aunt. But now Irmgard has met me, Ida's grandson. She suddenly has a Brazilian in the family.
I got out of the car, we looked at each other, and I thought, yeah, we're family.
Yes, I could tell straight away.
Oh, stop!
My grandmother was born in this small town in northern Germany. She was baptized in this church. But why couldn't she stay with her father and her siblings? What happened to the family? Why was my grandma adopted?
1920 to 1925, those were bad years economically, especially here in the countryside. It wasn't easy to raise children without a mother, and Aunt Ida's mother died giving birth to her. Grandpa was left alone with 5 children, so he left little Ida in the care of the Herzog family.
5 years later, they went to Brazil.
In 1925, the Herzogs emigrated to Brazil with little Ida on a ship called the Vera.
Thanks to the local Heritage Society, we're able to get a sense of the town of Visbeck in the 1920s. The Taper family lived in this house. At that time, a few years after Germany had lost the First World War, many people left their homeland. In this region, more than a quarter of the population decided to seek better lives in the New World. Their first stop was often Bremerhaven, once continental Europe's largest emigration port. My grandmother emigrated to Brazil from Bremerhaven. She was less than 5 years old at the time. Here, more than 7.2 million people boarded ships to start new lives on the other side of the world. For Ida and her new family, the journey took them via São Paulo to Porto Alegre in the state of Rio Grande do Sul. At the German Emigration Center, stories like that of my grandmother are collected and brought to life. Between 1920 and 1930, almost 75,000 Germans emigrated to Brazil.
Most people left for economic reasons. The economic crisis hit in 1923. The middle classes lost their wealth, and many young people saw no hope for the Weimar Republic. And there were lots of families of farmers who wanted to continue working in agriculture. For them, South America was a good bet. The United States no longer offered free land. In fact, land was extremely expensive there. But in Brazil, that opportunity still existed.
Ida and her foster parents traveled for over a month. That's how long it took to cross the Atlantic in those days. The cabin they slept in 1925, would have looked something like this. Relatively comfortable. It's a far cry from the sailing cargo ships that had taken the first German colonists to Brazil 100 years earlier. Then people would be crammed together for several months, at the mercy of a lack of wind and of food supplies running out. And heaven forbid, an outbreak of disease. The dead would simply be thrown overboard. In 1824, these first emigrants travelled 11,000 kilometres to a completely new and unknown world, Brazil. In 1808, the Portuguese royal family had also landed there, fleeing Napoleon and his army. The country had been independent since 1822, ruled by Don Pedro I and his wife Leopoldina from Austria. To cultivate the sparsely populated south of the country and defend it against neighbours Uruguay and Argentina, Brazil recruited foreign colonists. One reason Brazil opened itself to European migration was that the end of slavery was in sight. Workers were needed on the coffee plantations, for example. Brazil was among the last countries to abolish slavery. Until 1888, enslaved Africans and their descendants worked on the country's plantations.
The abolition of slavery in Brazil dragged on for several decades. It was generally accepted that it was an obsolete model, that slavery could no longer be maintained in the long term, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to get new slaves because of the British blockade of the slave trade. That raised the question for them of where to find new workers who were cheap and obedient.
So the Empire of Brazil actively recruited Europeans, enticing them with free passage, free farming land, and low taxes. By 1831, 11,000 German-speaking immigrants had arrived in Brazil. The 19th century government was deeply racist, so giving land to formerly enslaved people of African origin was unthinkable.
European immigration policies cemented the idea that free labor was performed by white workers. That's the legacy it has to this day in the history of Brazilian society. There's a complex racist stereotype that fundamentally associates being black in this country with slavery alone. But in fact, these enslaved men and women were the most important people in the development of Brazil.
When slavery was abolished in 1888, formerly enslaved people were systematically excluded by the white elite. There was no plan for integrating them into society. They began their free lives as second-class citizens in the growing slums of the big cities. Even today, millions of Afro-Brazilians live in precarious circumstances. They're underrepresented in politics, business, science, and culture. This too is a consequence of 19th century immigration policy and its aim to, quote, modernize, unquote, the country.
Progress was seen as tied to Europeanization, not just of customs and traditions, but of the population itself. Racist ideas played a crucial role. The idea was a so-called whitening of the population in a Brazil that was made up of very different communities. According to the thinking of the time, this was seen as negative and a hindrance to development. That's why they wanted Europeans, and not just any Europeans, but especially Central Europeans. They were seen as virtuous, hardworking, ambitious, and obedient. That made them desirable subjects. One of the focal points was the German states, because it was known there were lots of poor people there, and that there was pressure to emigrate.
Viele arme Leute, viele Leute, die auch den Druck haben, auszuwandern.
At the beginning of the 19th century, the French Emperor Napoleon had turned Europe into a battlefield. Poverty was rife in many regions, and poor harvests only made things worse. At the same time, the population was growing, which increased food shortages and unemployment. One example is Hunsrück, in what's now the German state of Rhineland-Palatinate. Zimmern is a small town that still has close ties to southern Brazil. 200 years ago, the first colonists set out from this area after being actively recruited by the Brazilian government.
Mostly they were skilled farmers who also owned their own houses. People had to sell their houses to afford to immigrate, so they weren't the poorest of the poor. The money had to come from somewhere. You could say they were socially mobile. They felt they'd be better off somewhere else, and were willing to make a new start. Of course, there were also some very poor people by the standards of the time. Communities were often happy when those people emigrated. They wanted to solve social problems using emigration. There are lots of examples, but people don't like to talk about it.
A few kilometers away is the village of Buch, a good example of the impoverished communities of the 19th century. One of my great-grandfathers came from here. I've asked one of the locals to show me around.
This is my parents' house, built in 1712. The style is typical, a small house with a barn and stable right next door.
My ancestors probably lived in a house like this.
Probably, yes.
I can't help noticing how present the topic of emigration still is in the region today. At the Regional Museum in Zimmern, there's a special exhibition marking 200 years of German emigration to Brazil. Letters sent to those who stayed behind tell of hardships, but also of a life of freedom without poverty. They were farmers, craftspeople who started a leather industry in southern Brazil, and beer brewers. They also sent something valuable back to Germany: precious stones.
In the first wave of immigration, journeys were still made by sailing ships. And for the ship captains, bringing gemstones like agate back was welcome, because it was ballast. Once cargo and passengers had been unloaded, the stones would replace their weight. So it was a win-win situation, and it triggered a real boom here in the region around Idar-Oberstein and along the Idarbach River. From the 1920s, the number of gemstone cutters quadrupled in the space of 40 years.
In the end, the region that lost so many young workers also got wealth in return. Migration provided opportunities for those who stayed as well as those who left. And today, like many places in Germany, the town of Zimmern has itself become home to immigrants in search of a better life. Back in 1824, the people of Hunsrück hoped to find that better life in São Leopoldo in southern Brazil. It says, "In memory of the fathers." This monument was erected in 1924 in honor of the 39 first German immigrants. They arrived on July the 25th, 1824, in São Leopoldo, in the state of Rio Grande do Sul, on the banks of the Rio dos Sinos, in the far south of Brazil. Shortly after we came here to film, the area was hit by massive flooding, the worst in the history of Rio Grande do Sul. it devastated São Leopoldo, a city of 200,000 inhabitants and the cradle of German immigration. When we visited at the beginning of April, the museum was still intact.
Morning. Welcome.
The museum takes us back to the year 1824. On July the 25th, 8 families and a few single men arrived here. Towards the end of the year, the number rose to 126. They were farmers, craftspeople and soldiers. They came to cultivate the land and secure the borders. This is what they brought?
By today's standards, it's a big trunk. But in 1824, it was for an entire family. Their whole life was in here.
The essentials for a new home.
They'd have really needed this little pan. It would have reminded them of their house, their stove, their kitchen. It would have brought back happy memories.
The museum has collected 10,000 objects and thousands of documents. Their sports and music equipment is especially important to the Germans. The immigrants also brought something else with them to Brazil: their Protestant religion.
This is our most important exhibit. It shows that they didn't just have practical things with them. After all, the soul was the most crucial thing in terms of survival. This is a Bible from 1765.
The Bible itself was saved from the recent floods, but the museum was badly hit. Centuries of immigration history submerged. Even 200 years ago, founding a colony right on the river proved to be a bad idea.
The travelers who passed through reported to the provincial government that the chosen location couldn't have been worse. Every time the river flooded, the town would be underwater.
Rodrigo Tresbach has written several books about the German immigrants and their decisive influence on southern Brazil. As small farmers growing crops and raising livestock, they were the pioneers of family farming, which still today supplies 70% of Brazil's food. It was a hard life, especially for women.
Out of everyone who left their homeland and emigrated, the women suffered the most. There are several letters from women who really struggled because of domestic problems. Many were pregnant when they immigrated. They had to look after 5, 6, sometimes as many as 10 children. These are families from a region that was left extremely poor following the Napoleonic Wars. People were left disabled and traumatized. The women were the spine of every family, including for the children. They were absolute heroes.
Whether in the fields or the factories, it's hard to overestimate the role women played in the economic rise of the region, which today is one of the most developed in all of Brazil. The architectural legacy of German immigration can be seen in many small towns in Rio Grande do Sul. German traditions have survived. Annual church fairs are called Kerb, as in the regional dialect of Hunsrück. But these days, all Brazilians come together to celebrate. You can also taste the German cultural heritage, like here at the Café Colonial Walachei in Pomerode. It's funny, it reminds me of my childhood. There are some things here that I never liked, like blood sausage. But the pork fillet here, the apple strudel, the fried pastry, the cake, the sausage, who could ask for anything more? Such a big meal, so early in the day?
The people who worked in the fields would leave early in the morning. It was the same with my grandfather. People would have a really hearty breakfast because there was no knowing when they'd get to have lunch.
One other essential thing is jam, which we call schmear.
Das machen wir. Fertig.
Here we go.
Pronto.
Just like at home. It reminds me a lot of my childhood. Wonderful. The next stop on our journey is Pomerode in the state of Santa Catarina. In the 1860s, Germans from Pomerania settled in this subtropical region. In total, about 300,000 Germans found their new home in Brazil. Some around Pomerode still live almost the same lives their ancestors did, running family farms instead of large estates and monocultures. Among other things, the Sievert family grow palm trees.
At the beginning, the palms really saved people. They came here to the jungle. There was nothing. At first, they survived by hunting animals, fishing, and from fruit and palm hearts. The palms are used for building, the leaves for sleeping on, and mainly as food. These were the first houses here. The children slept up here.
Up there?
Yes, and the grown-ups slept below. They'd make a fire outside.
The plant is also useful as animal feed. The farm is home to 3 generations of the Sievert family. A rural life like something from a storybook. But in the 21st century, farming alone wouldn't be enough to support them. Another important income source are the tourists who come here to get an impression of what life was like for the first German immigrants.
Ich verkaufe meine Geschichte für die Touristen.
I sell my story to the tourists. I tell them how we live, where we came from, and how things have changed. If the children can make money from tourism, then it's sustainable. Without tourism, they will leave and move to the big city or somewhere. But I think the way we're using tourism means that we can carry on.
Rogerio Sievert transports his harvest a few kilometers up the road to the Baumann canning factory. The Baumanns are also descendants of German emigrants from Pomerania. They've maintained the language of their ancestors, though it's a little different to the German I'm used to hearing.
Kleine Palmette, die haben dann satt und dann muss ich wieder streichen. Dann dauert es 5 Jahre, bis die dann Kraut sind, dann aufhacken und dann hierher bringen, dann machen und dann dauert wieder in ein Glas extra machen, dann verkaufen.
I think I only understood 20% of what you said. More than 90% of Pomerode residents are of German descent. German culture and language are important here. German is a compulsory subject at this bilingual school.
Guten Tag! Heute haben wir Besuch.
Hallo, guten Tag.
Hallo, schön, dass du da bist. Hallo, hallo, schön, dass du da bist.
I'm really impressed by their curiosity about Germany and how easily they can speak a language that's not their mother tongue.
You can only maintain a culture if the language lives on. If we can get these children to keep speaking German, regardless of whether it's colloquial or grammatically correct, then we'll have achieved a lot. We live in a place that was once a German colony, so it's about encouraging them to value the language in their daily lives.
The tradition of schooling brought by the German immigrants continues to have an impact. Literacy rates in the regions they settled are among the highest in the country. Do you like learning and speaking German? Is it interesting?
Education was very important to the German immigrants. Wherever a colony was established, they'd build two things that were fundamental to their way of life: a church and a school. Very often, the government didn't keep its promises, including when it came to providing an education system for the immigrants. So most colonies had a self-funded school. That's why, for a long time, so many of them kept German as their first language, not Portuguese.
Another place with a strong tradition of German immigrant culture is Blumenau, the third largest city in the state of Santa Catarina, with over 360,000 inhabitants. It's famous for its Oktoberfest, the world's largest after the one in Munich. It attracts more than 600,000 visitors each year. The colony here was founded in the middle of the jungle around 1850 by Hermann Blumenau, a German pharmacist, botanist, and committed colonist. Historian Sueli Petri knows all about the city's history. It's considered one of the most important centers of German immigration in Brazil. For a long time, German was spoken here as a lingua franca between subsequent European immigrants from places like Italy and Poland. Blumenau received a further boost during the wave of immigration of the 1920s.
A new wave came, the new Germans. They weren't simply looking for a home. They were professionals with technological knowledge. They wanted to re-establish themselves economically because their capital was stronger here. Companies and businesses had surpluses they wanted to invest. That was great for us. Many industries were established, which brought a lot of advancement. There were also architects who gave our main street, the street of the 15th of November, a new look. They brought us new architecture.
Today, Blumenau is a modern city. But behind the historical facade so popular with tourists, there's something darker, a growing number of neo-Nazi groups. There's also a lack of acknowledgement of the indigenous people who lived here before the immigrants and who were nearly wiped out in a brutal war of extermination.
There are hardly any historical records because they themselves weren't able to tell their story. We only have our version, based on what was in the newspapers and letters at the time. So we have the immigrants' perspective, but we don't have the indigenous side of the story. It's a very sensitive issue.
As in other regions of southern Brazil, the first German immigrants traveled here by river. But this region around Blumenau, for example, was also inhabited by others, indigenous people. And that's who we're going to talk to now. We drive 2 hours off-road into the highlands. Walgeres Pripre belongs to the Laclano Xokleng people. She picks us up from a crossroads. Around 2,800 indigenous people live in this area. It wasn't easy to set up a meeting with Walgeres Pripre. There's a lot of mistrust towards white Brazilians, and not without reason. The trauma of colonial land grabbing casts a long shadow.
It's a very painful story because of all the massacres we've experienced, all the brutality that took place here in Santa Catarina.
The more infrastructure the European settlers built, the greater the conflicts with the indigenous population. In bloody clashes, Brazil's indigenous people faced the superior weapons of the colonists. The government soon hired mercenary troops, known as bugrerios. Indigenous men were killed, while women and children were enslaved or forced into sex work. 2/3 of the indigenous population were wiped out. Walgeres says that at the end of the 1920s, there were only about 100 indigenous people left in the region.
These are very difficult stories to tell.
A century on, the indigenous people here are still fighting for land rights against some very powerful opponents.
The white people don't understand that the area has always belonged to us. The argument is always, the indigenous people want the land, but they don't cultivate it. Nobody's ever understood that our relationship to the land is completely different to that of the whites. You want a piece of land so you can build something on it or grow something and sell it. That's not what I want. I want to preserve the land because the air I breathe depends on it. The river that runs through here depends on it. If I don't preserve it, you won't be able to drink the water or breathe clean air. Do you understand that? They're completely different visions of what land means. This has caused great suffering for my people, and we're still suffering today.
Walgeres Pripre is an archaeologist, an expert in indigenous history and building practices. She's the first woman from her community to earn a doctorate, and she's determined to preserve the culture of the Xhokleng, Kaingang and Guarani people who still live in this area. For a long time, the white ruling class banned them from practicing their traditions and even speaking their language. Today, in this bilingual school, the children are taught in both Portuguese and Xhokleng. They even sing the Brazilian national anthem in the indigenous language.
My role is to encourage others and to keep sowing these small seeds. I'm delighted that these seeds are being sown in Germany too.
I agree. Finally, how do you say thank you in Laclano? Thank you very much. Most people in Germany are probably unaware of the role that German immigrants played in the war of extermination that almost wiped out the indigenous people of southern Brazil. In Brazil itself, the issue was long hushed up. Even today, it's still a taboo topic in many places.
I know a lot of Brazilian students, people in academia who are really critically aware. But the average person on the street isn't generally like that. They'll say something like, "We Germans, we were actually the better kind of Brazilians. We were hardworking. We were the ones who made the country arable." This narrative of German colonization and German achievements in Brazil is still very dominant. On the one hand, of course, these immigrants did achieve things. Nobody can deny that. But you can't just ignore the crimes that were committed, or say that the people who suffered were just collateral damage.
Back in Campo Bom in Rio Grande do Sul, I'm visiting my family. Like anywhere else in the world, the kitchen is the center of our home. My father, my sister-in-law, my brother, my mother making mayonnaise, and my niece is hiding somewhere. There she is. A typical Sunday lunch with the Becker family. German potato salad, made using Grandma's recipe, of course. There's Brazilian grilled meat. We have the best of both cultures. Even though my grandmother left Germany when she was less than 5 years old, she never lost the sense of being German. But losing all contact with her family after the Second World War was traumatic.
It was really interesting to meet my mother's family.
Os parentes da minha mãe.
When my father died, my mother was very sad. She was always homesick for Germany. She never stopped being German. When there was soccer on, she'd always say, "I'm going for Brazil, but I'm going for Germany more." She remained German.
I've set off to search for the house where my grandmother lived until my grandfather died in 1969. One of my cousins shows me the way. My paternal grandparents once worked as farmers in Grolante, about 50 kilometers from Campo Bom. Later they ran a store that sold agricultural products, which eventually burned down. Today, the house where my grandmother raised 10 children is in ruins. In many ways, my grandmother's life is typical of the German settlers of southern Brazil. They often lived in isolation, with their own social structures, their own schools, churches, cultural clubs, and newspapers. Over time, that led to other Brazilians accusing them of not integrating. Or worse, forming breakaway cells within the Brazilian state.
Dazu kam dann noch eine Deutschtumspolitik aus Deutschland.
There were also policies relating to Germanness that came from Germany itself, attempts to solidify and maintain German culture and language among the immigrants. That also contributed to the idea that they were socially isolated. But if you look closer, you see it's much more complex. There was just as much assimilation, integration, and contact as there was isolation in homogeneous communities.
Wie es auch isoliertere oder vielleicht homogenere Siedlungen gab.
I meet Frederic Schulze at the Ibero-American Institute in Berlin. He's an expert on German society in southern Brazil, as well as the conflicts that arose between German immigrants and the Brazilian state. By the time of the First World War, voices warning of a threat from Germany were growing ever louder.
The world wars intensified these debates. There were questions of a German threat within Brazil, and debates about political measures to combat such a threat. Brazil declared war on Germany in both world wars, so there was also a question of internal security. At the same time, there were riots by Brazilians targeting German businesses when Brazilian ships were sunk by German U-boats. That fanned the flames. The Brazilian government then closed German-speaking institutions and banned the German-language press.
Deutschsprachige Institutionen geschlossen hat und auch die deutschsprachige Presse verboten hat.
At the end of the 1920s, quite a few immigrants of German descent sympathized with the National Socialists in Germany. Local Nazi chapters were founded. Brazil had the largest Nazi party outside Germany. Children sang Nazi anthems in schools, and the newspaper Deutscher Morgen was one of Hitler's most important propaganda tools among the German community. Initially, Brazilian President Getúlio Vargas sympathized with Europe's fascists. But in the run-up to the Second World War, Vargas stepped up assimilation efforts under pressure from the Americans. The Nazi Party was banned, German clubs and schools were closed, and speaking German was no longer allowed. All of this affected my grandmother too.
There was a supervisor in the shop who wouldn't allow us to speak German. Everything was marked with signs. If people wanted salt or flour, they pointed to them because they weren't permitted to say the German words.
After the Second World War, contact with Germany had broken off. It had been very important for institutions like German-speaking schools and the church. People and money were sent over to rekindle German culture. But of course its reputation had been marred by the war and the emerging knowledge about the Holocaust. Another factor was the highly nationalist Brazilian regime of the Estado Novo, led by Getúlio Vargas. It put a stop to those efforts and ensured that state-run schools were set up in these areas.
Nobody in my family speaks German anymore, except me. My parents' generation didn't learn the language properly and didn't pass it on. After the war, it took decades for the next generation to begin to take an interest in their German family history again. This is the cemetery in Rolante. The graves have German names on them. My grandmother's foster parents, the Herzogs, are buried here. So is my grandma, Ida. My grandmother passed away in 1997. Before she died, she tried to make contact with her sisters in Germany, but unfortunately she didn't succeed. They never saw each other again. Last year, one of her nieces came here to visit her grave. That was a very emotional moment. 2 years earlier, my father had been to Germany and had met his German cousins for the first time.
I met my mother's close relatives. It was very emotional. The hug I gave them was the hug they could no longer give each other. I cried a lot, but I was very happy. It cleansed my soul.
A century after my grandmother had to leave her German family behind, the two branches of the family are connected once again. The link is me, a Brazilian living in Germany. We travel back to São Paulo for a special chapter in the history of German immigration. This is the Museu Judaico de São Paulo. Formerly a synagogue, it's now Brazil's largest archive of Jewish history. Jewish immigrants have lived here since the early 16th century. At the beginning of the 20th century, a large number of migrants arrived, fleeing pogroms in Russia and Eastern Europe. The Nazis came to power in Germany in 1933. From then on, Brazil became one of the key South American countries for Jewish refugees, alongside Chile and Argentina. Shortly afterwards, São Paulo's Jewish community launched an aid program to help the exiles.
They immediately set to work welcoming the children and mothers. Sometimes mothers came without their husbands, who were fighting or were in concentration camps. They founded a children's home so that the women could go to work. And they founded an association to support them. They also collected donations so that others who had to leave Germany could also come.
Eles fazem fundraising para poder trazer outros alemães que estão precisando vir.
In that period, 16,000 Jewish immigrants found a new home in Brazil, mainly in booming São Paulo. The professional experience they brought with them helped spur economic development. The beating economic heart of modern Brazil, what people don't know is that São Paulo is the biggest German industrial city outside Germany. Long-established German companies have their Latin American headquarters here. Some of them have been in the country for over a century. They create 250,000 jobs in São Paulo alone. There are a huge number of German companies operating in Brazil and influencing the economy. 200 years after the first Germans emigrated to Brazil, migration is now going in the other direction. According to a study by the Brazilian Foreign Ministry, 160,000 Brazilians now live in Germany. Tayana Santos works as a nurse in the intensive care kidney clinic of Berlin's Charité University Hospital. Germany urgently needs specialists like Tayana. The government recruits people from Brazil, just like the Brazilian government once recruited Germans. The nurse from Rio has lived in Germany for almost 2 years. Is work more difficult here or in Brazil? What differences are there?
It's more difficult here.
Why?
Because of the language. The work itself is very similar to Brazil, depending on where you work. In my case, it's intensive care, but the language problems make everything more complicated.
How are people who want to work in Germany received?
You're not prepared.
Because of the language?
Because of the language, the lack of housing, the immense bureaucracy, and also the lack of openness.
Tayana has also experienced racism while working in another hospital. Her decision to work at the Charité University Hospital was a deliberate one.
I decided to come to the Charité because the people here are inclusive. Here I have colleagues from all over the world. Everyone here is very patient with me. If we get stuck while speaking German, we can try in English. Or we can try again in German, and they speak a bit slower. There are a lot of difficult people, but there are also a lot of really nice people.
Back in Rio de Janeiro, Tayana sometimes worked at several hospitals at the same time in order to be able to afford vacations. In the end, she emigrated for financial reasons. Do you think about going back to Brazil one day?
No. I feel very much at home. As much as I love Brazil, I have no intention of going back.
Germany has gone from a country of emigration to a country of immigration. According to the German government, 21 million people here have a history of immigration, including me. A Brazilian passport from my birth country and a German passport because of my ancestry. First and foremost, I'm Brazilian. That's where I was born and grew up. This passport connects me to German society, especially when I go to vote. Just like my ancestors who emigrated to Brazil, I too set out to discover the world. I know that migration has always been part of this world, and always will be.
Constante processo migratório.